So in this video, I want to talk to you about Docker and ASP.NET Core. For the year I was away and out of the country traveling with my new bride at the time, Docker became sort of a big thing, and I never really had time to dig into it to understand what it was about. And as I started to work with ASP.NET Core, or ASP.NET 5 as it was called at the time, I realized that it was an interesting technology, especially as it related to ASP.NET Core, because of its ASP.NET Core's ability to run on Linux and Mac as well as Windows. And so as I started playing with it, I thought it might be interesting to show you guys sort of what I've discovered and how I think it works and those sort of things. I certainly don't have the deep knowledge of Docker yet, and hopefully I'll get there. But I think it's an important technology for most developers to at least have some exposure for. Now, as usual, I don't have a lot of slides, so I'm going to dive right into some code. And I have a really simple ASP.NET Core app that I want to go ahead and just show you. This is a really simple app. It just does a couple of things. Instead of walking you through the code, it's a pretty simply built application that really does two things. So I'm going to open up Firefox so we can go to the port. And the home page simply lists information about the environment. I'm running this right on Windows as a self-hosted app right now, and so we can see that it's looking in this folder for it, and that it's on Windows 10, and we're using the Core CLR. We could be using the regular CLR version, but I'm using the Core CLR, and I'm still in RC1 and x86. So I can see some different pieces of what it's running. I'm also running a small little API here that just returns a message. Actually supports post and delete and those sorts of things as well if we wanted to add new ones, but we're not going to go down that road. You can see sort of what it does when running bare on the metal of Windows. So let's talk about Docker for a minute. In a lot of development environments, we start to think about the way we want to get things into production or even into test environments. And over the last maybe 5 or 10 years, a lot of this has been moved into virtual machines. So we'll fire up a clean virtual machine, install our app, run it. People will hit that virtual machine and they'll be able to test it and whatever. And there's this guarantee that this is a clean version of that image. And it's something we've gotten used to as sort of a benefit of starting with a virtual machine. But of course, these virtual machines are pretty big, and we have to set them up and make sure we're versioning them and all of that. And this is where sort of Docker comes in. Docker is a unit of work that's smaller than a virtual machine. They're called containers, and it really is this isolated environment in which to run applications. And the power isn't just that it's sort of isolated from everything else in these containers. It's also that the containers are built by deriving from other containers. So you could imagine that some containers might have the operating system, and you might have another container that needs a technology like Redis or maybe SQL Server or whatever technology is another dependency of your application. And so they might start with the operating system level one and then just pile on the bits that are that other dependency. And that's really how it works. If we look at a website called hub.docker.com, this is a repository for Docker images, these pre-built images. And if we go ahead and look for, I'm just going to look for Microsoft for a minute. Microsoft has a number of these. And the most popular of these is the ASP.NET container build image. And this is basically pre-built images with different versions of ASP.NET built on them. And so we can take this image and say, okay, this is going to have all the prerequisites that are required, and it's going to sit on there. In fact, if we look at, let's take the RC1 Core CLR Docker file. This is over in GitHub, and we can see what it starts out by saying, hey, this is the image I'm going to start from. This is the base image. And as developers, this can make a lot of sense. If you think about this as deriving classes, this is really deriving environments in that same way. So you can walk down that chain of different environments. The Debian Jessie image is really just a Debian Linux image, and then it has a bunch of operations to set up that environment. Here's some environment variables, and then run some operations like calling and updating libraries, and then finally, if we went all the way down to the bottom, we could see that it's actually going ahead and getting DNX and the specific version we want. But this is the whole file that sort of sets up that environment. And we can use these as the basis for ours, and there is this repository. So how do we actually make this happen? Docker runs on top of Linux images, and that's either on physical boxes or virtual machines, more often virtual machines, but it can work in either case. And Docker has a product or an installer for Windows called Docker for Windows that installs a small shim of a virtual machine that Docker can be run against. It's a small Linux image. Microsoft at the same time is working towards supporting Docker on top of Hyper-V so they can have the same thin experience, but directly with Hyper-V and without having to necessarily use Linux. So we're going to see Docker's going to be in both environments where we can use Docker against Linux images as well as Windows images as time goes forward. So even if you're thinking, well, I'm just stuck in Windows, I'm not going to worry about Docker, I still think it's an important technology to understand. Let's go ahead and take our application and deploy it. And let's start by looking at our Docker file. So our application here has a Docker file here in Visual Studio. And Visual Studio actually has coloring for this. And this is where we can actually have different instructions. The pounder commented out, and then let me actually talk about what our Docker file does. First, we're going to say, hey, let's go get it from this very specific image, which is that ASP.NET image, the default ASP.NET image, which happens to be based on Mono, not on Core CLR, but it's close enough. And once we have that starter image, we want to change that image by doing a couple of things. The first thing we're going to do is copy our application to an app folder, just a folder named app onto the machine. And so this is going to actually take from the Windows file system and copy it into the image of the Docker system. It's going to effectively change the directory to that folder, and then it's going to run the DNU restore command, essentially take what is in our system and go ahead and pull down all of the NuGet packages. We're then going to tell it that we have a port that we're going to expose, 8080, from the container. And then we're going to go ahead and just run the actual website. And so creating this image, it's almost like a batch file of things to do once the image is started. So let's see how this works. I have Docker for Windows installed, and one of the things it supports is a little terminal for us to access it to. Most of the things we're talking about are going to be at the command line, as you'll see here. And if I in here, Docker is the command, and then there's a bunch of subcommands under it. So if I say Docker without anything, it's going to show me a bunch of the commands that are supported. But let's clear that, and let's assume we want to start from scratch. And I'm going to go ahead and move into my projects directory. So I'm going to do that with cd /D for the D drive, and this is essentially a bash shell, so you're going to need to get a little comfortable with how bash works. And the D drive, we could actually say D:, and it'll change it, but /D will also work. /projects is my folder, Docker ASP.NET Core source, and then my actual code is in another subdirectory called Docker ASP.NET Core. Great. If we do an ls, we can see that this is actually that directory that has this Docker file in it. So how do we create an image? We're going to say Docker build. And we're going to name it. I'm just going to use the convention of using company name, and then I'll just call it Docker ASPNET. And then I'm going to tell it the directory to use, and in this case, period, for this current directory we're in. And here it'll go ahead and you can see it actually doing those commands. This is actually the calling of the dnu restore command, going ahead and filling in this new image file with all of these files that we're going to eventually need. And the building, that script is run when we create an image. To build this image that includes all the information from the original, from the from image, and then all the additional files or requirements or whatever necessary to this new image. So when we fire up an instance of the image in a container, it already has everything it needs in it. And I'll show you the list of images in a moment. So now it's completed it, and you can see these steps here that it added as part of the whole process. And so if we do Docker images now, it'll actually show us a list of images. And here are pre-downloaded or pulled versions of the ASP.NET images. And you can see their sizes can vary. This core CLR is pretty small, whereas these two based on mono are actually pretty big. And then because we based ours on mono, it's going to be the size of this ASP.NET package plus everything we did. So it ends up being somewhat large at 1.3 gigs. Now that we have an image, we can actually start one up. We can tell it to run an image, and we can do that with Docker run. And then there's a couple of different commands here. First, /t to support TTY, which is something that ASP.NET Core currently requires. At some point, it won't have to, but currently it is requiring that. Actually, I'm not going to use -d this time. -d will detach so you can run multiple instances, but this will actually just keep it so that all the external stuff will dump to the console so we can actually see what log messages are being shown. Then I'm going to do /p for port mapping. So the application, as we saw earlier, is exposing 8080 as the port number, but I just want it to be 80. So I'm going to tell it that I want 80 to reroute to that internal number. So this is effectively saying the host Linux VM that we're using is going to listen on port 80 to what the container itself is exposing as 8080. So there's a mapping between the VM and the container by using those port numbers. And then I just name the image. And so in this case, it's going to be Wildermines, Docker ASP.NET. And if we run it, you may have seen briefly the small piece at the bottom where it showed you the initial console messages from it. But let's open up a browser. I still have Firefox opened. And I happen to know that the IP of the internal machine of the VM that Docker for Windows is using is this 10.168.99.100 address. That happens to be it on my machine. It may be a little different on yours. And now we're actually running in Docker, and we can see a few things to sort of verify that. We can see the OS is Debian 7 from Linux, of Linux, and then it's running on the Mono runtime. So it's running on top of Mono, but still using the runtime version of RC1 of our application. And what's interesting is because it's running on Mono, it's not running DX Core. It is running actually the 4.5.1 version of Mono on Linux. And that's a perfectly appropriate way to run these applications. But let's take this same situation and let's do it in Azure instead. Right? We have the same sort of situation going. How do we get it to... Actually, let's go back. So let's go back and look at what's happening. If we stop this process, we can use Docker PS, and it will show you that there's actually a running container. PS is listing out the currently running containers. By hitting Control-C, we just disconnected ourselves from it, but the image continues to run. In fact, if I run this again, we'll see that it refreshed fine. It's still listening. And if we go to, let's say, the API messages we're still going to get those from inside the container. Docker supports stopping this image as well, and the easiest way is to actually use one of these more friendly names that it assigned for you. Lonely Kirch. I think you can actually name these yourself, but I haven't gone down that road because these are usually pretty easy to remember. And then I can also use RM to actually remove it. At this point, it's a stopped, and I can stop and start that same container. It doesn't destroy the container until I use the Docker RM for removing the container lonely. So if I do Docker PS, it's now gone, but the image is still there. So this image could be used. In fact, I could actually run it multiple times in containers if I had reasons to expose it in different ways. Let's say I wanted to expose it on different port numbers or with different host names or those sorts of things. But being able to do this same thing inside of a cloud provider is really where this starts to be really interesting. You could have one virtual machine out there someplace, like in Azure or in AWS, and then run a number of these Docker images, especially if none of them are handling lots and lots of load. Let's actually do that. I'm going to use Putty, which is a desktop app that is useful for connecting by SSH to a remote machine. And so I have a machine out there in Azure, and you'll see my super secret username, but you won't see the password, luckily. See if I was able to get in. Woohoo. So here I'm on Linux, and I'm actually going to have the same situation. If I do Docker image, images, well, actually see there is a Microsoft ASP.NET image out there, but no, none of my images. So the first thing I'm going to want to do is get the source code. Now, I could have exposed FTP and copy it up there, but this happens to be a public repo in GitHub. So for me, the easiest is going to be to go ahead and just do a git clone. And this is a repo you can go look at. It's a public repo. Honestly, the code isn't that interesting. And then I'm just going to put it in a folder called Docker ASP.NET Core as well. And we'll see that this is the same code we had before. So I'll go to source and I'll go to Docker ASP.NET Core. Let me list that one more time so you can see it. So this is that same code we had on my local machine, and there's that Docker file. So we can go ahead and use Docker to create the image in exactly the same way. Even though we're running on Linux here, the Docker tool is already installed, so I can say build Wilderminds Docker fun. You can call it whatever you want. I'm just trying to be easy. We'll go ahead and put the dot for this directory, and the same things are going to happen. Now that we've built these Docker images, we can now see our new image there, about the same size as it was before. And that means we can now do the same thing. Run -t for TTY. Let's do D for D. Let's do P to match to map the ports, just like we did before, because we're still exposing the same port number, and we want to go ahead and expose it as port 80 in the VM. One thing that's interesting about this is you do have to expose port 80 through Azure or AWS or whatever your cloud provider is, because it may block that port by default, because it might not know that you want to expose web traffic through it. So that's a configuration of the VM itself. It's not a Docker thing. And then the image will be Wilderminds, Docker fun. And as it fires up that container, it'll run it. And if we go back to the browser, but this time it's going to be an actual named instance in Azure, which is Wilder Linux, cloudapp.net. And here we're running that same application inside of a container inside of Linux in a VM in Azure. And we're going to get that same experience that the API also works. So if we go back, we can actually see that when we ran this, these are the actual things that the requests coming in. So we can see that we got a get argument to the messages controller, which is that API controller. Then it's writing out the value. And this is because of the way that that particular application is exposing the logging. The logging is going out to the console by default. So I can actually look at this, but you can see the whole request, how long it took, 0.3 seconds. Actually, it says 0.03 milliseconds. I'm not sure that's actually accurate, but we can see all of this working in exactly the way we might expect it to. And so in this way, you can start to play with ASP.NET Core and use them in Docker containers at your heart's content. Hopefully this has just given you a taste, or hopefully given you the interest to go learn a little bit more about Docker. So the first link to go to is docker.com. You can get the Docker for Windows tools there, or it'll show you how to install it on Linux or Mac if you're using them on those. ASP.NET Core 1.0 you can go and get at get.asp.net. It's still called ASP.NET 5 there. And when the RC2 ships, which this video will probably still be up for RC2 and RTM, it'll be called ASP.NET Core 1.0 by then. You'll also see a link to my Pluralsight course if you're interested in more ASP.NET, my blog. And that project on GitHub is GitHub Sean Wildermuth, Docker ASP.NET Core. Got a couple of ASP.NET Core examples up there. The World, which is a... Got a couple ASP.NET examples up there, including Wilderblog, which is my new version of wildermuth.com that I'm releasing entirely as open source using Bootstrap 4, ASP.NET Core, hosting on Azure, etc. So that might be interesting to take a look at as well. Well, thanks for watching this, and I hope you're enjoying this series of videos.